Good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to this Luce webinar. It's an introductory session on strengthening the lung cancer patient's voice in health policy and regulatory decision making. Everybody who's on this call is very aware of the importance of patients having a voice, but sometimes it's really difficult for patients to have a voice in policy and in regulatory decision making. And I know from my discussions with many people in the lung cancer patient community that this has been really challenging thing for the community to have the voice it needs. And the reason that Luce has decided to do this program today, this webinar today, focused on this topic, is that it wants to provide all of the European lung cancer patient community with some tools, with an understanding of policy and regulatory decision-making processes, and an understanding of how people who are representing the lung cancer patient community can have a voice in these processes. We're very fortunate today to have three really great speakers, people with huge experience in both the policy and the regulatory and access decision-making space. And the webinar is broken down into three different areas, one focused on policy, the other on drug medicines regulation, and the last on health technology assessment and access decision making. Excuse me. You will see we're recording this webinar, and that's important, so you can go back and you can look at the webinar again. It will be available from Monday on the Luce website. We have three speakers, as I say. Each of them will speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then we built in time for questions into the program. If you want to ask questions, if you want to let me know that you have a question, please use the raised hand facility and just click on raised hand. But the other way you can ask questions is to put questions into the chat, and we will monitor those, and I'll ask questions on your behalf. Without further ado, I want to move ahead with the program itself. We're going to kick off with a presentation that's focused on patient involvement in European policy decision making, and we're really fortunate to have somebody who has a long expertise in this area. I'm very pleased to introduce Nicola Bedlington, who is a former Secretary General and currently serving as a special advisor to the European Patients Forum. And Nicola can introduce herself a little bit more and talk about her background in this area. So I'm just handing over to Nicola now, and just a kind reminder to Nicola to keep to time today. Thank you very much. Over to you, Nicola.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Good. And we just need to have my slides up, please.
So the slides are there. We can see them. The only thing, if you can enable your webcam, Nicola. Yeah, that's it. Great. You're ready to go.
You can. I can't see the slides actually, so that's a little problem for me.
You will probably need to open your or click on the bottom bar on the PowerPoint.
Very good. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. That's great. So we're all set. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Kathy. As you said, I've been working with the European Patients Forum for a long time. I'm currently their special advisor, but had the pleasure of being their Secretary General for 12 years. And prior to that, in the 90s, I was the Executive Director of the European Disability Forum. So I've been around the block a lot in the Brussels space, and it's a pleasure to be here today to share some of my views and some of the lessons that I've learned over the years. So why advocate? Why will it make a difference to patients at the end of the day? I had this discussion with a fellow advocate a few years ago, and he was really adamant. He said, yes, it will, if we get it right and we really close the deal to ensure whatever we achieve with policymakers to make legislation work for patients is translated into real world settings. The real stuff only really starts when the legislation is, or a policy is actually adopted. So in my presentation today, I'd really like to explore the status of patient organisations and their added value in policymaking, patients' increasing role across the spectrum of policymaking, some concrete examples of patient leadership in changing policy at European level, and some of my own personal learnings over the years. So the added value of patient organisations, advocacy and policymaking. The European Patients Forum ran a survey amongst its membership a few years ago and really looked at the added value of patient organisations in the policy and advocacy setting. And it became clear from the survey that patient organisations provide that end user perspective. They really help policymakers to understand the experience of living with a disease or condition and embed that in the legislation or policy proposals in an appropriate way that makes sense for patients, that leads to better outcomes for patients at the end of the day. It's clear that patient organisations are active in all stages of policy development in a range of institutional settings, so they're very present. They also work across a big range of policies, not only health and social policies, but increasingly this idea of health in all policies. And essentially, they contribute to a more nuanced and balanced policy making based on their values of fairness and equity. There are some challenges, and this came clear in the survey, in the work that we did with EPF members. The lack of and unpredictability of resources and funding is key, and the lack of unrestricted funding to really drive campaigns is one issue. The credibility and alleged lack of independence of patient organisations, they're often seen still by some policymakers as simply a facade for industry. Getting that balance right between professionalisation, a professional campaign and representativeness, really a genuine, authentic voice of patients is sometimes a little bit challenging. The emergence of new online patient communities, I actually see that as an opportunity rather than as a challenge, because these new young online communities are very agile, very swift, and can really contribute and complement the role of traditional patient organisations. Overcoming the culture of tokenism and cronyism among some policymakers, just ticking the box or always talking to the same old person about a policy issue, not bringing on board the new evidence. And a lack of performance measurement, or rather a lack of knowledge on how to measure the impact of patient organisations, is a problem. But there are some drivers. Of course, leadership, and everybody sitting in this virtual room knows the value of leadership. Having a strategic, anticipatory approach is also important. Deep collaboration with other patient groups and other patient communities is also key, demonstrating solidarity, maturity, shared learning, and effective use of resources. Structured capacity building is also really important on specific, quite complex policy topics. And where needed, alliances with the broader health stakeholder community. And I'll show you a couple of examples of how that's happened over the years. And finally, last but not least, explicit commitment to transparency to really demonstrate the trust and credibility of a patient organisation driving a policy agenda. It's clear that patients have an increasing role across the life cycle of medicines, and we see in clinical research their transformation from being research subjects to co-researchers really driving the research agenda. We see an increasing role for patient organisations in the HTA space and decision-making space, and of course Neil will talk a little bit more about that later in the session. We see the patient's voice increasingly loud and influential in the agencies, in the competent authorities, and Natalie will expand on that in terms of the sterling work that's happened in the European Medicines Agency. But patient organisations also have a really important role when it comes to shifting public perception about the importance of research and other associated issues like the importance of responsible data sharing. And we see that through the work that's been driven by patient organisations on Data Saves Lives, for instance. Less successful is patient involvement in research and ethics committees. And this is, in a sense, one of the lacunas of the clinical trials legislation. We fought for more involvement of patients in research ethics committees, but that didn't happen, and we still need to actually square that circle moving down the road. And all of this came much more apparent to me in my work in the European Patient Academy on Therapeutic Innovation, on patient education, and the more recent project that was focusing on making patient engagement in the entire life cycle of medicines much easier, the Paradigm project that looked at how to make patient engagement easier for all of the stakeholders, from research prioritization right through to pharmacovigilance, a real-world evidence collection. But let's look at the policy side, because patients have become increasingly involved in shaping policy. Before I do that, I'd like to just look at this rather simplified slide in terms of looking at the EU legislative journey. And in reality, it's much more complex than this, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of a taster of what happens through that sometimes very long legislative journey. Clearly, it all starts at the European Commission, and the Commission typically launches a consultation, undertakes an impact assessment on a particular directive or policy. But what's really, really important, has been our experience in the past, is that patient organisations talk to the relevant Commission officials while that policy or directive is still just a twinkle in their eye. You need to have that very, very early dialogue to get your messages across loud and clear. The legislation then goes to the European Parliament, and a rapporteur and shadow rapporteur is appointed to manage the consultation process in the Parliament, in the relevant committee, and then eventually with all of the parliamentarians in plenary session. And this is a key opportunity for the umbrella organisation and their national members to work and talk with the relevant parliamentarians, the rapporteur, the shadow rapporteur, but also champions in the Parliament, and introduce specific legislative changes, proposals, amendments that would make the directive much more workable for patients at the end of the day, based on our knowledge and experience. And that the national patient organisations can really work with their national MEPs in a very effective way. It then goes to Council for their opinion, their perspective, their agreement. And again, that's another opportunity for patient organisations to influence member states, the governments across the member states, and particularly the country that is holding the EU presidency at the time. That can be enormously important. After much wrangling and negotiation and discussion between the Parliament and the Council, a final directive is adopted, and then it's transposed into national law. But that is not where the story finishes. It's so important that national patient organisations are equipped with the knowledge, the expertise, the negotiating power to talk to their governments to make sure that the legislation is actually implemented in a way that makes sense for patients at the end of the day. So that, in a nutshell, is the legislative process, just to give you a little bit of a backdrop. So what's happened over the years with regard to advocacy work at European level? A couple of examples. The Pharmacovigilance Directive from a few years back. EPF and other patient organisations were successful in including in the legislation a specific clause on direct patient reporting of adverse events, not only through the company, not only through the healthcare professional, but direct reporting to the authorities. And we did that through working with empathetic MEPs in the European Parliament, but crucially, the PGU, the organisation at European level, actually representing community pharmacists, was very much on our side and was a very strong ally. Another example, more recently, is the clinical trial regulation. Despite a lot of discussions with the European Commission, we weren't really happy with the draft regulation where it came to talking about informed consent. We felt that that was very, very weak and didn't reflect the true concerns of patients out there regarding the importance of informed consent and clarity there. We also felt very, very strongly that there should be more transparency about clinical trials, even when they fail, and the information about clinical trials should be made publicly available and also made available in accessible layperson's language. And we were successful on both of those topics, again in the European Parliament, collaborating closely with a campaign platform called All Trials in the UK. The UK was part of the European Union at that stage. So again, demonstrating close, quite sophisticated collaboration with another stakeholder. But it's not just hard legislation that counts, it's actually also what's called soft policy. There's an enormous amount of exchange of expertise, know-how, experience. Countries are very keen to so-called leapfrog, learn from other countries and be able to implement legislation or implement policy change, soft policy change, and not go through all of the teething pains that the other countries have actually gone through, and come together and really think and look at how to improve things through learning from good practice. And we've seen a lot of this, and patient organisations have played a critical role in some of the joint actions that have driven forward patient safety, quality of care. As we all know, the transformation of health through digitalisation is hugely on the agenda right now, many opportunities there. The whole arena of patient empowerment, looking at health literacy, quality of information, looking at shared decision making, looking at self-management. These topics that are core for patient organisations are on the political agenda because of the drive of their patient organisations and their communities. And equity of access, which is a fundamental for pretty much every patient organisation out there operating at European level, really putting this topic on the political agenda and calling the institutions to task to do something about equity of access, really key. So I just wanted to give a final example when it comes to HTA collaboration at European Union level, because it is so timely and so topical. After many months, many years of negotiation between the Parliament and the Council, the governments, the national governments, an agreement was reached a few days ago with regard to the legislation that frames HTA collaboration at European Union level. And again, in those months and years of wrangling, the patient community, alongside many of the health stakeholders, were absolutely adamant this legislation should remain on the legislative table, because there was at one point a risk that it would just be dismissed because it was so tough to actually find solutions. So we were very influential alongside others there. We were less successful in some aspects of actually embedding the patient's voice in the legislation itself. There's some really important aspects where patient involvement is referred to and is key, but what we actually wanted in an ideal world was to actually be part of the governance, be a full member of the coordinating body for the health collaboration moving forward. So we didn't win everything, and we need to live with the outcome of that legislation, but really monitor it as closely as possible to ensure that our influence is actually there. So a few examples for you that I hope have been quite useful. And I just wanted to finish my presentation with a few personal learnings. I think what's been really important for me over the years is the importance of solidarity, community, identity, avoiding competition across the patient community in this kind of disease ranking, my disease is worse than your disease, because that just gives the opportunity for policymakers essentially to divide and rule and not make any proper progress. The value of a robust advocacy plan is also really key, demonstrating clarity of purpose, strategic thinking, and really thoughtful preparation. Evidence-based advocacy, of course, with an end goal in mind. And thinking about positioning, should our style be very moderate, solution-oriented, reasoned, reasonable, discreet, or should we be more direct, radical, uncompromising, going to the media, etc.? Or should it actually be a blend of both, depending at what stage of the advocacy campaign we're actually at? Ongoing intelligence gathering on both the process and the issue is really crucial, and we need to be ready to modify our approach and tactics as a campaign takes speed. We need to be quite opportunistic in effect. And as one patient advocate actually said, we need to constantly do our homework. We need to know our audience. We need to identify who is the key target or targets and research this person thoroughly. The key policymaker, the key policy shaper. Who are the champions around that person? Who are their adversaries? What information about this person will really help us to build a bridge towards our policy objective? What are his or her concerns, pressure points? What keeps them awake at night? What might actually mobilize her or his support? What are the kind of trade-offs we need to think about? We need readily accessible messages, slogans and sound bites, a strong patient's voice. Patients are part of the solution, 150 million reasons to act, to be really memorable both in the minds of policymakers and shapers, politicians, but also with the media. We need to own the narrative and the terminology. Words matter. We need to come across as a powerful voice, not a pathetic little group to ignore. And we need substantive, credible, scientific and anecdotal evidence wherever possible. Economic arguments are also super important. Unfortunately, the human and societal factor is not sufficient, and having economic arguments alongside other really important things that matter to patients at the end of the day directly, really key, especially in a climate where everybody's looking at the sustainability of health systems in the future. And once we have been successful in changing a policy or a piece of legislation, the real work starts. We need to make sure that our members know exactly what has been agreed and can negotiate in their own countries or in their own disease areas on effective implementation. Otherwise, all the hard work is pretty pointless and the legislation change is nothing. We need to live with the outcome of the legislative process. The perfect can be the enemy of the good, and we've seen the example of the HTA legislation. It was something similar when we looked at the directive on cross-border healthcare, patients' rights on cross-border healthcare, not quite perfect, but we could live with it and work with it. Integrity, independence, transparency, and credibility. These aren't just beautiful words, they're absolutely fundamental in building the trust that's needed to actually run a really effective campaign. And not just with one or two partners, with every single partner out there, even opponents. Patients, because of their unique position, are in the centre, and patient organisations increasingly can be natural conveners to bring different stakeholders together that don't always agree to really move on solution-oriented discussions. But patient organisations should never become institutionalised or comfortable or complacent, but really be the powerful change agents that they are. And that's my lasting message, last message to you all. And I'd like to give the floor back to Kathy to moderate the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nicola. It's always such a pleasure to hear such words of wisdom, and your experience really comes through, and you've had really some very wise messages on how patients can secure a stronger voice and some of the conditions that need to be in place to ensure that that happens. We already have some questions in. I think, Diego, you have your hand up. If you want to, we're going to unmute you if you want to ask Nicola your question.
Let's see, Diego. Yeah, I think we can hear you now. Hi, Diego.
I think, yeah. Hi, Alfonso, Casey, Nicola. Well, first of all, Nicola, thank you so much for your great presentation. I completely agree about all the issues that you have just said. I'm honestly really happy that you tell about the importance of avoiding competition among patient groups, because I think that this is one of the issues that we need to work on. And in my opinion, many of the challenges or barriers are across diseases. I mean, they affect to everyone, but most of the time we are advocating, thinking only in our specific groups of patients. I think that is completely normal, but I think that sometimes we are losing some opportunities because we are using different arguments, different messages when we are in contact with people responsible of taking some decisions. So it's true, I completely agree about, for example, WeCan or EUPATI, that there are more and more networks that we can work together. And I would like to ask you, Nicola, in your opinion, what is missing to work better as a whole community that and we can advocate together for common solutions? In your experience or your opinion, what do you think that we can work or we can improve to work together better?
Again, this is based on my experience at EPF, and I think having a very clear understanding of what networks like EPF as an umbrella and WeCan and EUPATI are responsible for in terms of cross-cutting issues affecting all patients, and having that very clear understanding that that's their agenda, obviously supported by their member organisations, significantly with case studies and their perspective, but making really clear what the responsibility and mission of disease-specific organisations or organisations within a disease realm actually are, and being very, very clear and very explicit about that. I think that clarity is sometimes not always there and is needed. I think also thinking about where is possible to pool resources, to pool knowledge, to pool expertise, because it is, you know, there aren't that many resources out there, and really using those as effectively as possible. And also negotiating, sometimes it'll be a case of a specific, lung cancer being an example, perhaps supporting another cancer arena, and, you know, them conversely at a time when lung cancer is really prominent on the agenda, doing that as well, and just having that kind of, I guess solidarity is the word, but also coordination, basic management as well. Has that helped to answer your question?
Nicola, we've some other questions in. There are two questions. One is you touched on online communities and the fact that patient communities are changing radically, particularly over the last 10 years or so. In the past, we had patient organizations. Now we have online communities. We also have expert patients, and we also have individuals, both patients and caregivers, who would like to contribute and have their voice heard. One of the questions that has come in is, how could an individual, either patient and caregiver, have a voice in the political process, either at a European or a national level?
I think there are lots of opportunities to get involved. Obviously, the online communities are looser and perhaps demand a little bit less in terms of resources and energy. But if you're committed to actually becoming part of a patient organisation, then obviously you go through your local patient organisation that feeds into the national organisation, and so on and so forth. But there are always opportunities. I think umbrella organisations and other networks like WeCan, EUPATI always welcome the individual expertise, the individual reflections, etc. And I think that other stakeholders are also listening carefully to the individual alongside the more representative voice. It's providing a different, perhaps, reflection, but nonetheless valid, authentic and genuine, and I think that is to be welcomed. And an individual that wants real policy change, I think, can do that. I remember back in the day in the MS community, there was a young woman from the UK who was furious about the postcode lottery. So she wrote to her local MEP, and that led to a resolution in the European Parliament on equity of access to people with MS within countries, but across countries as well. So enormously powerful. Her name was Louise McVeigh. If you're interested, she's still on YouTube somewhere, making a big, strong voice in the European Parliament.
And just coming back to the online communities, because as you say, they're loose, they're not registered organizations, but important conversations are happening in these communities, and they certainly have a perspective. You also mentioned this thing of one voice and one message and consistency in message when you're trying to influence policy. how important would it be for these online communities to work closely with registered patient organizations in terms of having that one strong voice?
I feel that it's really powerful. I think, as I said earlier, you've got the agility and energy and swiftness of an online community that can harness a message in a heartbeat, essentially, and all of the social media work around that. And then you've got the more traditional patient organizations that have the legitimacy because they're a membership organization, they have the governance in place, they have the history, etc. And blending that is superbly powerful. But I think we really need to make sure that they're not seen in parallel lines, that they come together on joint campaigns. And I know that online communities really value and use some of the work that more traditional patient organisations have undertaken over the years, and vice versa. There shouldn't be hostility, there should be an embracing. And actually, by definition, a lot of the online community members are young patient leaders. And what would be nice is if they're sort of primed to actually take over the more traditional organisations in terms of succession strategy and really future-proofing organisations moving forward. So I think that there is an opportunity for deep collaboration and respect. And I think that happens in most cases. Just occasionally there's a little blip, like in any family.
I know that there's some representatives of online communities here on the call, so if anybody wants to add a perspective here, it would be great. Please put your hand up if you want to either comment on what's being said or ask Nicola further questions. While we're waiting for that, I wanted to touch on evidence-based advocacy, which is a term where you see used more and more today, without perhaps having that shared sense of understanding of what that term actually means. Can you tell us, Nicola, what you think evidence-based advocacy is and why this is important for patient communities in terms of having that strong voice?
Sure. I mean, it's not necessarily evidence in terms of scientific evidence. I don't think, I mean, there are projects, powerful projects out there that are public-private partnerships that engage academia, patients, industry. They exist. But I think from my perspective, evidence-based advocacy is a patient organization going back and consulting really carefully with their membership, with their constituency about what a position paper, what a statement should actually look like, and actually back that up through survey work, through extensive liaison with that community to really nuance that in the best possible way, and also to think through some of the counter arguments and the solutions carefully. And that means reaching out sometimes to other stakeholders as well. That for me is what evidence-based advocacy is about. And as I said, ideally you need to have economic studies. You need to be able to actually prove the economics case for advancing on a particular policy or project. That's sometimes possible, and even if one can nod to that and work that's happened in the health economics arena, I think that is also really powerful as well. But it's really about how the patient organisation does business with its very strict governance structure to be able to actually represent genuinely the evidence base of that community.
Mm-hmm. And that presumably would also help address one of those the problem that you raised in your presentation around perceptions of patients and patient input, and that there are still some misperceptions around patients and with patients having vested interests and so on and so forth. Just one last word on how, like, clearly evidence-based advocacy is one way to counteract these negative perceptions. Can you suggest other ways that patient communities, and indeed the lung cancer patient community, can counteract those perceptions which are a barrier to policymakers listening to them?
I think the strategy has to be multi-pronged. I think things have improved over the years. I remember when I first started at EPF, every summer holiday would be disrupted by a board journalist phoning me up to say, where does EPF get its funding? but that doesn't happen anymore. I think that the narrative has shifted, and that's very important. I think having very, very clear frameworks for working with industry is absolutely critical. I think demonstrating where collaboration with industry is important and valid, and the public-private partnerships, looking at EUPATI, looking at Paradigm, also clear, but being very, very specific and explicit about, while you can partner with industry on certain things, there'll be areas where there will be some quite key disagreements, and the independence of that patient organisation is really clear. And over the years, I think certainly EPF can point to where we haven't agreed with industry on certain topics, and we've made that clear also in our advocacy work with the European Parliament. So I think increasingly organisations can demonstrate by good practice that they are independent, but they can collaborate with industry and with other stakeholders where needed. The other piece I think is, and it's not always very easy for patient organisations, is not to be over dependent on one source of funding, to have the diversity of funding sources across the spectrum of industry, but equally not be too dependent on public funding. And when I was with the European Disability Forum all those years ago, we lobbied the Parliament hard to get €1 million for the European Disability Forum in its formative years from the Commission. And my goodness, we were criticised. How can you challenge the European Commission if you're getting this money from them? This is impossible. You're going to be in the pocket of the European Commission. So complex area, but yeah, I think diversity across the board is really key.
So some great advice there, Nicola. Thank you so much. We're going to move on to another important stakeholder for the patient community. You've already touched on the fact that the European Medicines Agency has done some tremendous work in the area of bringing the patient voice in to the regulation of medicines in Europe. And I'm really, really pleased that we have Natalie Baer, who is Patient Engagement Manager from the European Medicines Agency, with us. Natalie is going to talk to us about patient involvement in EMA's regulatory decision-making processes, and touch on where the opportunities are for lung cancer patient representatives. So over to you, Natalie, and I'm going to give you a chance also to say a little bit about yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. So I've worked at EMA, gosh, many, many years now, and I've had, I feel very fortunate that I've been able to kind of be there for the whole journey of patient engagement at EMA, and you'll see that it has been a journey to arrive at where we are today. And so yeah, I'm responsible for patient engagement at the EMA, and that involves obviously liaising internally with all the different departments across the EMA to make sure that they have patients involved everywhere, but then also very close contacts and networking with the patient community directly as well. So I hope you can see my slides. So the first slide, so I'm just going to also at the beginning to kind of set the scene. I'm not sure if everybody knows how medicines are approved in Europe, so I'm just going to give you an overview of how this occurs. So at EMA, we are basically the European regulator, which means we assess and approve and monitor medicines which are then for use across Europe. It's not quite so simple. We also do a lot of things around that. So for example, we do provide advice on the development of medicines, and then we also get involved to some extent with HTA, with access to medicines as well. And of course, it's our responsibility as well to make sure that everything we do is then provided in a way that is easily accessible and readable and understandable for everyone that it's going to impact. So how are medicines approved in Europe? So there are two ways that medicines can be approved. There's what we call the centralized procedure, so that's at EMA, and I'll explain more about that. But there's also the national procedure as well, and that's when pharmaceutical companies for certain medicines can just go to 1 or 2 or 3 countries and apply for an authorization in that country. If they get the approval, then they can market the product, but just in those countries that they applied. At the centralized procedure at EMA, there's one application which they submit to EMA. EMA will do an assessment, and if they give a positive opinion, which then goes to the European Commission, if they give their approval, then this means that this is valid across the whole of Europe. So automatically, that medicine can be made available in any EU member state. So just to make it clear as well, it's not a choice for all of the medicines. So legally, pharmaceutical companies are obliged to actually come through the centralized procedure, so to EMA for all of these different what we call therapeutic areas. And you can see, of course, cancer is one of them. So all of the cancer medicines have to come to EMA for an approval. The benefit of this approval, you might wonder, well, why do they have to come to EMA versus just going to single countries? But it is actually a real huge benefit to have this centralized procedure, because what it means is that the medicine is available automatically. Well, not available. It can be made available. I have to make it clear that it is up to pharmaceutical companies where they want to market it, but it means once it has the approval, they can go to any country and put it on the market. It also, though, means that we have this centralized safety monitoring. So, you know, when you report adverse events or the healthcare professionals report it, it goes into a central repository, and we can monitor then the safety across Europe and make amendments if they're needed, which are automatically applicable also across Europe. It also means then that, so for example, the package leaflets, safety information, all of the written information is automatically available and translated in every EU language as well. So it's about having this harmonization across Europe. And it does mean as well that we have this access to a huge EU network of experts, which includes patients. The way it works in Europe, kind of in a nutshell, is that you have health or regulatory authorities in each of the member states. You then have the EMA, and those individual member states are represented on all of EMA's committees. And then you have the European Commission. So we feed all of our recommendations and opinions into the Commission, and they rubber stamp them. So it's a very complex kind of setup at EMA, but it's the way it works so that we can make sure we do have the opinions of everybody across Europe. So we have scientific committees dedicated for different things, like the CHMP is the main one that evaluates the medicines, but we have the committee, the COMP for orphan medicines, for herbals, the pediatric committee, advanced therapy committee, the CAT, and also the pharmacovigilance risk assessment committee, which is the safety committee. And as I mentioned earlier, each of these committees has members from every EU member state, and they each vote on the outcomes to make sure it really is a European-wide representation. And on a lot of these committees, we also have patient representatives who are also full voting members, and I think that's important to know. We also invite a lot of experts from across Europe, depending, because of course these representatives on the committee, they can't possibly know every single disease area, so they have their experts back in their countries, but also we call upon thousands of scientific experts from across Europe in those different areas as and when we need them. And of course we have over 800 staff as well in the EMA from all across Europe as well, representing all of them. So I mentioned that we also monitor the safety of medicines. I think just quickly to tell you that it's not just that we provide a positive recommendation and approve the medicines and they're out there on the market and we forget about them. No, it's even more important that once they are out on the market, we monitor the safety and efficacy. We need to make sure that the information we got, which is limited from the clinical trials, then is representative once it gets used by many, many more patients. So we need to make sure that it is as safe as we expected it to be, and it is working as well as it should be. So there's a continuous system of monitoring how it's working once it's been used by a lot more people. And I mentioned earlier, it's this central repository called EudraVigilance, where all of those safety reports and studies on efficacy as well get fed into this main European repository, and it means then we can have quick actions. You can see we might need to change something, we might need to change the dosing, changing the way that something's being used, we might need to restrict it, or even sometimes if unexpected safety issues have come up, we might have to suspend or even revoke an authorization. So a very important aspect of medicines. underpinning all of this is what we call multi-stakeholder engagement. So to be able to have proper information from everybody, we need to engage with all of the different stakeholders. And this is what we do at EMA. So we have the healthcare professionals, the academics, we have pharmaceutical companies, and of course, patients and healthcare professionals, all equally involved in all of our discussions, and that makes sure that we have these more rounded discussions and then more relevant outcomes for everybody. And so I'll come on to now how we do engage with patients, and obviously how patients are involved and how you can be involved as well. And today there are various opportunities for patients to be involved in different ways, and I'll go through those. I mentioned earlier it was a progressive journey, and I won't go through all of these, but just to show you that we started talking with patients, I think it was the HIV patients right at the beginning when we opened in '95. Then they started to become members of our committees. Then we developed a working group, which became a working party. Then we had a big framework of interaction adopted by our management, which really laid the basis of how we would engage with patients and consumers and their organizations. We had a dedicated department set up, and it went on, and we've just been progressing along the way. And I think progression is a good thing to highlight, because each of these things that we developed together with the patient community to make sure it really was being done in a way that was conducive to allow that important information that you have as living with a condition on a daily basis that we don't have. But we need to make the environment correct. We need to make sure that we support you properly so that we can really gather that important information, and we need to make sure that our systems are able then to accept and integrate that information that you're sharing. So stepwise progress, and that's why it didn't happen overnight, but it's something that we've developed over the years, and we still keep trying to refine and enhance and see where we need to change, and also to move with the times as things are changing, digital things, wearables, all this kind of thing. We need to also make sure we keep up with the times. This is just a graphic to show you the areas where patients are involved. When we talk about the medicines regulatory life cycle, there's really 3 phases. We talk about the pre-submission phase, the evaluation phase, and the post-authorization phase. So the pre-submission phase is when the company's developing the medicine. So they haven't actually yet submitted an application for marketing authorization, but they may come to us for advice on their development plan. They may have a medicine they're developing for a rare disease and they want to get an orphan designation. They might be looking at a medicine for children, so they need to have an advice on their pediatric plans. So this happens before they submit. Once they've done all the trials they need to do, they have all the information they think is enough to show that this medicine is safe and works well, and this benefit risk balance will be positive. They then submit this marketing authorization application to EMA, and then we have the post-authorization phase once it has got its approval and it's out on the market, and we have all the safety monitoring I mentioned. And along each of these phases, we have different ways that patients then can be involved, not only through the committee membership, but also other different ways, which I will explain a little bit more to you. There's different ways that patients are involved, but I think also just to highlight that there are different, not different only different activities, but different representation that the patients bring. So for example, they are members on the scientific committee and our management board. When they do that, they represent basically the whole patient community. So they are representing patients as a whole, not only their particular condition that they maybe have. When they are in other activities, say they come to a workshop or we do a consultation or on our patients and consumers working party, then they will be representing their particular organization and their particular therapeutic area. But then there are other times when we involve them in the individual medicines assessments, then they will be coming as individual experts with experience of a particular condition as a patient or as a carer, and so they're bringing their own views and their own opinions. Perhaps they've also had lots of discussions with other patients that they can also share, but they come representing themselves. And the reason also is because we share all of the information with them, which is confidential. And so they sign a confidentiality agreement with us and carry out a screening of potential conflicts of interest. So just to highlight the different representation that we have. So the different ways that they can contribute directly to the scientific discussion. So I mentioned the committee membership, the scientific advice. So this is when the companies are asking for scientific advice on their development plan. So we invite patients to these meetings or to give us input in writing if there isn't a meeting. And this is really, it can vary from anything. So this will be, companies will be explaining how they're going to do their clinical trial, what endpoints they're selecting, what patient population they should have. So this allows patients to really say, do they think this sounds like a feasible plan? Do they think that, I don't know, going to the hospital 3 times a week, which might not be very close to them, is feasible? Do they feel that the endpoints, so the measurements that we're going to measure in terms of the use of this medicine, is something that is appropriate for them? Is it meeting some of their unmet needs? And so there's various different ways that they contribute. We also have expert meetings, which are convened by the committees when we have an ongoing evaluation of a medicine. And again, systematically, we invite patients to these meetings to also contribute from their perspective. Sometimes the committees don't have time to convene one of these meetings, so instead they'll reach out to patients via written surveys or questionnaires, and we'll develop those and send them out. It's also a way to get input from the larger patient community as well. Again, stakeholder meetings is another way where we can bring all the different stakeholders together, and we have these on specific medicines as well, and we'll bring together the healthcare professionals, the academics, and the patients, and really have these in-depth discussions on what are the issues. Public hearings, this is also in the safety committee, so we can have a public hearing. These are broadcast live, again, so another forum where anyone can apply to come. Some people can speak in front of the committee, or they can just observe the meeting, broadcast live, and again, discussing very specific safety issues on an ongoing medicine, which the EMA is evaluating, and will be coming up with recommendations on how to better manage those safety issues. And the input we received during these public hearings was really instrumental in determining the outcomes at the end. Workshops and written public consultations, again, systematically sent to patients, and review of documents as well. And this is a fantastic help that they give us as well, to making sure that when we are writing these documents, which are for the patients themselves, we need to make sure that it's written in a lay language, that it's clear, understandable, not condescending, covering all the aspects you think are important. And so we send all of these documents out for review by, again, the patient community, and we're very grateful for all of this input that they give. We do a lot of monitoring and measuring as well, the impact. And this is really to be able to feed back to everybody that it does make a difference that you're participating. People give a lot of their time, and it's important to be able to feed back to them that it does make a difference. And I mentioned the review of documents. And when we looked at the analysis, about 50% of their comments makes a difference to the final document, which is great to be able to feed back. And also in the scientific advice procedures, we looked at how many cases over a 3-year period patients' input was making a difference to the final outcome. And about 20% makes an actual change to the proposed development plan or the advice that we're giving back to the pharmaceutical company. But also about 80% of the patients joining did agree with the plan. So it's important not to think that you have to disagree for that to be an impact. And also over 50% of patients' comments generated further discussion, and that's really the whole point of having them there. The networks, of course, without all of these networks, we wouldn't be able to have any of this input. So we have a really wide network of patient and consumer organizations. Anyone is welcome to register with EMA. We do have a certain criteria just to make sure that they really are working for patients, they're non-for-profit, that they're very transparent in the funding and things like that. We have our Patients and Consumers Working Party, which is 22 of our eligible organizations. We meet about 4 times a year, and we interact them also in writing when we need to. So it's a great platform for exchange of information. And also individuals. So any individual patient or carer who's interested can also register in a database that we have. They can register their interest to be involved in any of those activities I mentioned, but they can also register purely just to receive information from us on safety things, on new medicines, or anything in their chosen area as well. So it can be purely to receive information or to get involved. These are things that we also put in place just to make sure, I mentioned earlier, that the engagement we do, we're doing it as well as we can. And so one side of the coin is having various engagement methodologies. So sometimes you'll come face-to-face into a meeting, sometimes we'll do it in writing, sometimes we'll do a survey. And also we ask you, sometimes if people don't want to come in front of a committee, well, then they can join by phone. So we make sure we have different engagement methodologies. And on the other side, we need to really make sure that you are properly supported, that you understand, first of all, what is EMA, what am I getting involved in, what is the issue with the medicine that we're discussing, how can I contribute best, what is my role in this given meeting. And we do it in different ways. So some people like watching a video, reading an information sheet, some people prefer having a phone call, and we have annual training days as well again. So it's about being flexible and offering what suits people best. I mentioned earlier as well that we've come a long way, but by no means are we there yet. We need to keep refining, keep adapting and making sure that we are ready for anything that comes up. And we've seen with COVID that we needed to rapidly adapt and being able to accommodate everything. And my final message is just to say that, from EMA side, we really see the benefits, and it really does complement our scientific discussions to have that perspective that only you have of living with a condition, what it's like on a day-to-day basis, what things you would hope for in a medicine, what things you want the committee members to bear in mind when they are looking at the assessment of a new medicine. So we've seen the benefit. We need to make sure you understand that it is valuable for you to come in, and we really appreciate the time you take to come in and get involved with us. Again, it helps raise awareness and transparency. So when you get involved, you then see what kind of discussions go on sort of behind the closed doors at a regulatory agency, and the difficulties sometimes of weighing up those benefits and risks. At the end of the day, we need to only make sure that the medicines are safe and that they're working, but also we need to know when there is very little options for you, and that we really need to get as many of these medicines out for you as we can. Everyone has a role to play. We need to play our role. You need to play your role. But at the end of the day, it means better and more meaningful outcomes for everyone. So I think, yes, thank you. That was my presentation. I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for that, Natalie. It's incredible to see that journey, that roadmap that you showed us from 1995 through to today. I certainly have I've been very closely monitoring that journey, and it is really congratulations to yourself and to the team at EMA to really have made this very concerted effort to really pull in the patient voice and ensure that patients have a voice in regulatory decision making in Europe. I want to invite questions. Does anybody have any questions or comments on what Natalie has said?
Quite a lot of information.
No, a lot of it, but I do have some questions that have come in, but I just wanted, if somebody wanted to put their hand up and ask you a question. So I don't see any coming in yet, so maybe I could start off with the questions. A lot of patient communities are very closely linked at a global level, so they're very tuned into what's happening in the United States. So they see that lung cancer drugs are often approved much quicker and based on different evidence than in the United States than in Europe. And that's perhaps a source of frustration for lung cancer patients in Europe, where there's particularly in areas of huge unmet need. Do you have a connection with the FDA? Are you talking to the FDA at all about this to try and have greater harmonization between what the FDA is doing and what the EMA is doing? Not only in relation to patients, the engagement with patients, but also beyond that.
Yes, no, thank you. I mean, it's a good question that often comes up, and I have to say that, we don't. It's true we don't always agree, but we do share information, and sometimes there are medicines actually that are approved in Europe quicker or are approved, and in the States they're not approved, or it does take later. I think it really just depends. Sometimes it's the therapeutic area, but indeed we do share information. We do have a group on patient engagement, but then there is a group on all of the therapeutic areas as well. So there is a group on oncology, so between the FDA and EMA, and they have regular updates, and they share all of this information on the medicines, so that even if they don't necessarily agree, they will have shared this information. And just one other point as well, it doesn't always mean, sometimes so a pharmaceutical company will submit what we call their package, their dossier of information. We can only base the assessment on that information they submit. Now, sometimes the information they submit is not always the same to the FDA and to EMA, and it can depend on timing. Maybe if they come to EMA later, they've done an additional study, or vice versa. So sometimes it's not always the assessment's not always based on the same information, but there's definitely a sharing between the two agencies, and it's been really important, and it's been going on for many years. We have a sort of confidentiality agreement, and
But that's good to know that there is this kind of communication between the two agencies. Again, I'm looking to see any questions before I jump in with my next question, which is around evidence. So we had a discussion earlier on also with Nicola around evidence-based advocacy, and you've touched on patient evidence and the importance of patient evidence in drug regulation. Can you expand a little bit about what patient communities can do to help ensure that there is sufficient evidence about the patient perspective, and that's robust evidence that the regulators will really look at and say, okay, this really is showing us what's important from a patient perspective?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think there's different kind of elements. I think on the one hand, if you can register with EMA, that way, we have your details, that way, what we're getting involved in. I think from the, and when we reach out to you, if possible, it's great, because some organizations don't have access to individual members. So we find that if you already perhaps have, a pool of patients who would be interested to be involved with the regulators, that's already great to know, so that when we reach out to you, because sometimes we only have a few weeks notice of an activity that's coming up. So if we can already reach out to you and you say, oh yes, we've got 2 or 3 patients really interested to be involved, they've got experience, then it just means the process goes a little bit quicker. And that would be then to come into EMA and get involved in the different things that I mentioned, like the expert meetings or reviewing package leaflets. But it's true, there are other times when it's also valuable to have what we call the perspectives from the wider community, so perhaps a bit more representative of more patients. And that can also be if we send you perhaps a questionnaire or a survey, that you can then be ready to reach out again to your patient community and get that input from them. So an example, we have a new pilot ongoing at our CHMP. When we start, and at the moment it's just for orphan medicines, but it will be expanded later. And what we do is that when we start a new assessment of a medicine, we reach out to that particular patient community, so the patient organization, and we say, look, the CHMP is about to start this assessment. What would you like to share with us that you think is important for them to bear in mind? So of course, then it would be, it's good if you already have a sort of, not necessarily a whole system in place, but that you can be ready to say, okay, you have a way to contact all your members, you have maybe some experience on how to do a sort of proper survey. There are certain ways, and you can download templates and everything, but to do a survey that is perhaps recognized, and like you were saying, that then when the information comes into us, it can be really taken very seriously, and we can see that it was done in a robust way, collected in a manner. Make sure that you reach out to all of your members as much as you can, as fairly as you can. Make the questions, a mix of fixed questions but open questions, that kind of thing. So yeah, I hope that was helpful.
But that's great advice, and I suppose it's a call to action for Lung Cancer Europe, because Lung Cancer Europe could do that, could put those structures in place. That means the organization can move quickly if EMA reaches out to the organization to look for this kind of input, but also to think about surveying and how to increase capability in doing surveys to ensure that the data that is collected is as robust as possible. We do have questions coming in via the chat, so I'm going to read one out here. And one is, how can countries make it possible the approval of medicine in their country at the same time? So it's the approval to ensure that across Europe that the approval happens at the same time. This may relate to access as opposed to approval, but perhaps you can.
Yeah, so I mean, as I mentioned, the two ways. If they come to EMA, then of course the approval comes at exactly the same time. If they go to different national individual countries, then obviously it would depend on that regulatory authority, and you could either approach them or the pharmaceutical company to know. But it's true that, you know, EMA gives an approval. Then it's really up to the pharmaceutical company first to decide where they're going to market the product, and they usually start in just a few countries and then maybe expand. And then after that, you also have the challenge of it's up to each member state to decide whether or not they're going to reimburse the medicine, make it available on their health systems. And I think we'll hear in the next presentation a lot more about that.
Yeah.
So it is to say that EMA is one hurdle, but then of course we don't have a say in where it's going to be made available and whether it will be on your health system. So that, yeah, and that is difficult across Europe.
We'll ask Neil to pick up on that one, because that clearly is an important question around that kind of, to ensure that there's equity and access, and that everybody across Europe gets access to medicine in a relatively similar time frame. One last question before I let you go, and that's around COVID. You've touched on COVID. It's been an incredibly disruptive event. It's an ongoing event, but it clearly has had an impact on drug regulation. We saw that vaccines were approved in a way that we haven't seen other drugs approved in the past. Do you think that that will have a knock-on effect on cancer drug approval? Will we see drugs approved in a more agile, nimble way, or will we go back to the same situation as we had before COVID? That's maybe a very difficult question for you to answer, but I think it's of interest to the audience.
Yeah, I totally understand that. And I mean, I think, you know, a lot of people would be asking the same question. You know, they see now that the vaccines can be approved very quickly, you know, when you need to. I think we have to take into account that this was a very, you know, specific situation, and for normal medicines, and I think we will have lessons learned. I mean, already I know at EMA we are preparing a lot of things to do lessons learned, and that we will be taking away a lot of these learnings and see where we can improve the system, because we've seen it can be done. We are a bit bound with legislation. So for example, there is a legal timeline for how we do the assessments. You know, so for example, when we're assessing a medicine, we do a first assessment. We then have questions which we send back to the pharmaceutical company. That pharmaceutical company then has a certain amount of time to respond to us. It can be 3 months, it can be 6 months. We can't change that time. So if they need that time to respond to the questions that we've had on their data, they still, you know, we wouldn't be able to say to them all of a sudden, well, we're reducing that time. And there are other things like that as well, like for the package leaflets, there's a system in place, and it takes time to translate them, for example, to get them user tested and that kind of thing. So there are certain constraints, but having said that, I think we've all seen what can be done, and I think we need to take learnings from it and see, you know, what can we do to improve and speed up in any way.
Which is great to hear that you are reflecting on the lessons learned, and perhaps that will help ensure that what's good in terms of drug regulation that's come out of COVID, that'll be retained. But also maybe for the audience to think about the fact that you mentioned there's legislation underpinning the work you're doing, and if patients want to influence that legislation, they need to think back to what Nicola has been talking to us about, that there is this kind of link between these 3 presentations. Thank you so much, Natalie, for your time. It was really great. I think we've all learned a lot, and congratulations again on the great work the agency is doing. And
Thank
I'm
you.
sure you will have some people from the lung cancer community knocking on your door.
Yeah,
In the
please do register. I think we can send the link out, but please do get involved.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So on to last but not least, but maybe the presentation that's a little bit more challenging, but we have a great speaker here with us to talk about patient involvement in access decision making in Europe. And there's certainly some opportunities here for the lung cancer patient community, and it's brilliant. We have Neil Bertelsen with us, who has been very involved in HTA over the years and has really learned a lot about how patients can have a voice in this process. And we're really looking forward to hearing what Neil has to tell us about what lung cancer patients can learn about ensuring a strong voice. Thank you, Neil. Over to you.
No, thank you very much. And Kathy, just a time check for you, because my presentation is about 20 minutes long. So I just want to check, is it a hard stop at 13:30?
No, no. It's
you
you have the time to do that, yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, thank you for inviting me, and let's just get started, because there's, as Kathy has said, there is a lot to talk about here. And I'm going to start at the very beginning, and I make no apologies for that, because we often assume that everybody understands HTA and why we have it in the first place. So first of all, who am I and why am I talking about that? Well, I've been involved in an organization called HTA International for many, many years. I used to be the chair of this group, and we work around the world at ensuring that HTA bodies build in patient involvement processes and consult with and listen to patients as they make their decisions. I also work with patient-focused medicines development, which looks more broadly at how patients can input at various points in the pathway as medicines are developed. My background is as a patient advocate in the area of HIV, but I've worked in oncology for many, many years as well. So why do we need this whole HTA thing?
Sorry to interrupt you, Neil, because I'm not sure if it's only me, but there is a white slide. I don't know whether you can
I'll stop
exit
sharing.
I'll stop
sharing and start again. So I'm on full screen at the moment. So let me just stop sharing and then restart the share. Just hold on 1 second.
Yeah.
What do you see now?
Let me make you the presenter again, because I can't see anything at the moment. Just a second, please. You should see a window popping up now.
I do, and it says show this window. Yeah. And it's lit.
Yeah, now it's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you go now to full screen mode.
I'm going to full screen mode. Is it still okay?
Again, I can see a white slide. So maybe I suggest that you present on not on full screen mode. Like this, we can see the slides. So if that's okay for you.
Of course it's okay for me, and I apologize for that. I don't know what's happening. We tested it earlier and it was fine.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me
life issues. Sorry about the interruption.
Do this. Okay. So why do we need a process called HTA? Well, because we only have so much health budget to go around. You know, if in an ideal world, there'd be no end of money, and we wouldn't have to make decisions about how to allocate health resources, but we do. And so how can we decide who gets what? You know, the old way was really those people who shouted loudest or had the best connections with decision makers, they would often get more resources. And that's not fair. And so HTA was developed as a process to review the evidence and make a judgment based on the evidence. So it's an evidence-based process. And when we think about what is HTA, you know, it's different from country to country. No country does it exactly the same, but in essence, they're all trying to use the same evidence, the international evidence about a new technology. And what they're doing, which is slightly different from the process that nationally was talking about at the EMA, is they're wanting to compare it to what's the best thing that they already have. So how does this new medicine or this new technology compare to what we've already got? What's the difference? And ultimately, they're trying to make an assessment about should we use this technology, i.e., should we pay for it? If we are going to use it, how do we best use it? In which kinds of patients, or what kind of line of therapy? Those kinds of questions. And people get confused a lot by this term health technology. So it is a medicine, but it could also be a medical device, or it could be any technology that makes somebody's health better or impacts somebody's health. Why do we have it? So I've answered part of this question before, but ultimately, what we want is a repeatable process. We want a process that allows us to explore what is the evidence telling us that this new medicine can bring, and how have we assessed that evidence at the HTA body, so the actual organization that does it, writes reports showing exactly what evidence they considered and how they considered that evidence. And they publish that, and that's so that the rest of society can see what evidence has been looked at. And this is very different from, for example, in the United States, where you have private insurance companies. They will do this same process, but you never understand what evidence they looked at, why they decided to allow a particular treatment to be part of a care plan, but not another treatment. You never see that behind that curtain to see how that decision is made. So HTA tries to overcome that. It's not perfect, but it tries to say, look, the general public, everybody can see how we made this decision. Now, obviously, and this is where we get into problems, if the evidence doesn't convince the HTA committee, then usually there's no access to that medicine in the public healthcare system. It doesn't mean that the medicine is not available at all. As Natalie explained, it can be approved for use. It's just probably never going to be available until there's better evidence in the public healthcare system. A quick poll question. And so, Alfonso, this is our first poll question. We'll do this really quickly. It's just a sort of temperature check poll question. So
yeah.
Oh, you've got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see it. So the first question is, in which decade was HTA invented, if you like? So it was invented in which decade? And you can take your guess there and submit. And we'll just give that a couple of seconds. We won't take too long on this one. What's it looking like, Alfonso?
Yeah, we have like a tie, almost a tie between the 70s and the 90s. So when you tell me, I can close the. Let's give like a few more seconds.
Yeah,
okay.
let's close that one and ask a very similar question. So you said 70s, 90s?
So
okay.
It's 40% voted on the 70s, 60% voted on the 90s.
Oh, okay. Okay, so slight win for the 1990s there. This is a very similar question, if you can pull that up, Alfonso. Perfect. Oh no, that's the results last time.
Yeah.
And this question says, okay, you decided which decade HTA was invented. So in which decade then do you think that they realized you needed to include patients, families, societal impacts as important to a part of HTA? So think about your answer to the first question and then answer the second question.
So far, it seems that we have a clear winner. We'll give a few more seconds.
And the winner is?
And the winner is?
1990s, yes. So 1990s. So how did you all do? If you I'll just dismiss that poll, there we go. Okay, the answer is actually in the 70s. They were both invented at the same time, both concepts. And strangely, they happened in the United States of America that actually doesn't have an official HTA system, but they used to have in the 70s. And right from the beginning of the development of HTA as a concept, they said it was really important to include the views of patients and families, the political system. So they saw this as a holistic assessment of how a medicine or a technology fits in with society and healthcare. And yet, that was forgotten in the 1990s and early 2000s when HTA bodies in Europe were set up. And so what most HTA bodies did was say, we know how to do this. This can't be that difficult. The industry suppliers with information, they've got all the evidence. We know the clinicians, the doctors, we can ask them what they think about the evidence. We can ask some health economists what they think about the costs and the evidence, and then we can just all sit down together and make a choice. And it just didn't work out that way. So what happens when you try to do that is there are lots of things that are not clear in the evidence you have, especially when it's a new treatment. This is the first time it's being launched into the market. And so you have the clinical trials, but you don't have much more than the clinical trials, really. So a lot of questions come up then. What's the meaningful benefit to patients? Which of these outcomes that have been measured in this clinical trial, which of them are most important? Are there any particular groups of patients, like subpopulations or types of patients that have particular needs which are relevant to this decision we're about to make? Often, you're looking in the clinical data around changes in different measurements, in different endpoints. And you sometimes don't understand, what does a change in this measure actually mean practically for patients? And ultimately, what the HTA body is trying to answer is those two boxes that are in the red on this slide. Who will most benefit from this technology? And what is what we're likely to really see in the real world as the value of this treatment? And in order to do that, they really need patients to be included. And the way I would describe patient inclusion in HTA is very much, it provides a context and sometimes additional evidence that allows the committee to understand all of the evidence that they have in front of them. So the patients are able to translate what this evidence that's under review means. And let me just pause here and sort of take an even bigger step back. Healthcare systems don't buy drugs. We think they do. They don't buy drugs. Healthcare systems buy outcomes. That's what they're paying for. They're paying for the eventual, hopefully positive effect that a treatment can potentially bring. So they're paying for those outcomes, and they're using the evidence in order to give them a little bit of certainty that they're going to see those outcomes if they pay this money. And what patients can do is translate that clinical data into areas of evidence that patients think are most important to them. And they're able to translate that into what will be the overall impact on their lives, and be really specific about the things that they'll be able to do if they had access to better healthcare or better treatments. So people living with the condition can really clearly explain the impact of how that condition affects them. In terms of a HTA, they can translate those endpoints and measures used in the clinical trials into specifics. What does that specifically mean to a patient with this disease? They can highlight what those changes in those measures that are part of the evidence actually mean to their everyday life. And they can be very specific about which needs are still not being met with the current way that their disease is treated. So not with the new treatment, but with what's there existing. They can say, this works well, but this particular thing for this specific reason doesn't work very well. I'm just going to quickly go through how this happens. And it's hard to do this globally because it's actually lots of different kinds of processes, lots of different kinds of HTAs. Some health technology assessment bodies don't have any patient involvement at all. But I will say that that number is getting smaller and smaller. It used to be, if you go back 5, 10 years, that there was a handful of HTA bodies that were doing a lot of patient engagement, and a few others were doing a little bit of patient engagement. Nowadays, most of the health technology assessment bodies I speak to have some form of patient engagement. So it can start with informal discussions. So often a HTA body doesn't have initially a patient involvement process, and they'll be looking at a particular treatment for a particular disease and thinking, we need to know more about how this disease affects patients. And they'll pick up the phone, they'll find a patient organization, they'll have these informal discussions. Others then say, okay, we'll have an open consultation, which is open to the public, open to patients, open to physicians, and we will gain input generally from as wide a group of people as we can. Others say, actually, no, we need a formal process that allows patients to actually spend some time collecting their thoughts, collecting their evidence, and writing that evidence down in a standard way, and we will consider the patient evidence alongside the clinical evidence and the other evidence we've been provided by the other stakeholders. Finally, you can have representation at committee meetings. So this is, it's a bit like Natalie's explanation of these different levels of when you're an individual patient, when you're a patient organization representing a patient organization view. What generally happens is most patient involvement processes with HTAs are between a patient organization and the HTA body. But what happens in parallel to that is what they call patient experts. And what we mean in HTA terms is patients who have lived experience of the disease and are able to come to a committee meeting to answer questions about their lived condition, their lived experience. It's nothing about, do you know how regulation works, or do you know how clinical trials are designed? Patient experts in a HTA context is your expertise at being a patient. Very briefly, there are various steps along a standard HTA process. I won't go through these steps each one at a time, but to say the main areas are this area. The second green box along is where you gather information from all of the stakeholders, including patients. The third box along, a committee meeting to review the evidence. And then often here, where you get to look at what the decision is and critique that decision before it's made public. I want to just focus on these questions. I think it's really important that you understand exactly what it is that HTA bodies are looking for. This is an example from Scotland, but almost every country has something similar to this. How does this condition affect day-to-day life? How well do medicines that are currently available help manage that? They often want to know if the patient organization has been able to get information from any patient who's used the new medicine, maybe as part of a clinical trial. How does the patient organization expect that this new treatment will improve patients' lives and experience? And what kind of impact would this have on the patient's families or carers? The last one is really important. It's important that as patients and patient organizations, we are very honest about where we see the disadvantages of a new medicine. If we're constantly saying this medicine is perfect, there's nothing wrong with it, it looks absolutely fantastic, that's quite suspicious to a HTA body, because they know that no medicine is perfect. So it's important to answer that question well. What we're not looking for from patients and advocates is the clinical or scientific evidence that's being provided by the industry or clinicians. So often patient groups make the mistake of repeating evidence that they're finding in the public domain, but that evidence is already with the committee. They get that from other sources. So you're missing a chance to spend, to spend that time really talking about the patient aspects. Pure emotion without specifics doesn't work in the HTA context. It's no good saying this is a terrible disease to live with or to die from. You have to really be specific. What is it that makes it terrible? What are those symptoms that are most burdensome? How do they affect everyday life? Very brief case study here, and I just really am running out of time now, so I really want to just whiz through this one. I've deliberately picked one that is not an oncology case study because I wanted us to have a bit of distance here. This was for ulcerative colitis. It was a treatment that probably would not have been approved for reimbursement, except, if I go on to the next slide, the patients were really able to articulate exactly why the condition is so bad and why the current standard of care, which is surgery to remove part of your bowel or colon, why it is so devastating for patients and why it's not really an option. And so they were able to argue that there was value in delaying that surgery for as long as possible. People with this condition could then get on with their lives, knowing that one day they would still need this surgery. But in the meantime, they could have a family, they could finish their university studies, they could start their career without worrying about that surgery. And I will stop there, Kathy, and hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Neil. You finished a little bit earlier than I assumed, but it's really great that you've done that. So that gives us a little bit of time for questions. Again, I would encourage people to ask their questions. We did have a question earlier on to Natalie about that equity and the differences in access to treatments between European countries. And Nicola mentioned the fact that we have the European joint assessments, joint HTA assessments, that's just coming through. Do you think that that will help ensure equal access?
I am not convinced that it will, and I'll tell you why. So healthcare budgets are set nationally. They're a political decision. So actually, I think thinking of these three presentations we've had together, Nicola's presentation at the beginning was how do you work with policymakers? So the fundamental issue in terms of access isn't the HTA process itself, it's how much healthcare resources have been devoted in your country to healthcare. And then within those healthcare resources, has there been any special ring fencing of resources for particular conditions? Sometimes that happens for rare diseases, sometimes that happens for cancer, where there's an extra protection around the resources available. But when you talk about these disparities between different countries, what they're really talking about with this harmonization of HTA is the first step in the HTA process, not the whole HTA process. So the first step is clinically, what does this new treatment bring that we didn't have before? What's the added benefit of this new treatment based, on top of what we currently have today? The second part of a HTA assessment is usually around, how does this work economically? Or how much do we think we are prepared to pay for the benefit that we've identified in the first step? That second step about working out whether you think that fits with in your budget envelope, that will still happen nationally because it's national budgets, it's not European budgets for healthcare.
One of the things you said, Neil, is that patient input into HTA processes doesn't happen in every country. But you flagged up to us that the Scottish Medicines Consortium has this very nice guide and kind of questions that that the assessors would be interested in. Would it make sense in those countries where the patient involvement is not so good, that patient organizations proactively submit to
Yeah.
to the assessment processes without being asked.
Exactly. So that's why I think those questions are really key. Those questions that I outlined that HTA bodies usually ask. If you don't have a patient involvement process in your country, you can still answer those questions. You could still send in a letter or a dossier or however you want to do that with answers to those questions. Now, there's no guarantee that it will be looked at, but what it will do is it will say to the HTA body, oh God, these people know a lot about their disease, and this is information I didn't know that they knew. And that's one of the things that I often hear from HTA bodies when they start involving patients. They often say, we had no idea how much information was locked in the patient community and how useful that information was. So sometimes you just have to show that to them. And it's also worth just keep knocking on the door, asking for informal meetings. You might find that it works better when there isn't a current approval going through, a current process going through. So sometimes the door is easier to open when there isn't a lung cancer treatment that's being assessed right now, for example, because then you're asking to be part of the process, but without that suspicion that you're trying to, I don't know, somehow twist the process around a current assessment. So think about it in those terms as well.
But also, would it make sense? It's not just the lung cancer patient community going to the regulator. Is this a time when the patient community should be working together to try and change that reality?
And it's not just the patient community. So yes. When you're talking about changing the systems and the processes, it's very much going back to what Nicola was saying at the beginning. This is about having those credible arguments working together, often multi-stakeholder. So if the industry goes to the policymakers and say, we need a better HTA process, they won't get listened to. If the patient groups are also saying the same thing, if the healthcare professional societies are also saying the same thing, then together you have quite a credible voice from different angles saying, how can we be making these decisions when there's an important piece of evidence that we're missing from these decisions? And it's worth also sharing. You can go to the HTAI website, and I can share that link on the chat or afterwards. There's a lot of resources there, a lot of case studies, impact case studies that you could take to your HTA body and say, look, this is how other people are doing it.
Do you need some water? Are you okay?
I do need some water. Thank you.
So thank you for that. Again, it's a call to action for the patient community and how you can proactively maybe bring about those changes that are needed. We had some questions in from Finland, from Paul in Finland, around a problem that's faced, and it's very typical in cancer, and I know it's been a problem in the HIV community in the past, is around expanded access and compassionate use. And here you can have the patient falling between two stools. So you have an approved product, but it's not yet, so it's approved by the European Medicines Agency, but it's not actually got through the reimbursement processes. So how can patients influence that to really help ensure that patients who are really, really in need in this situation, this is a life-threatening situation, how they can address that very big problem?
Yeah, so this is something that's outside of the HTA remit, really, because the HTA takes time. And so I see exactly how this happens. And different countries have different local regulations about early, compassionate use schemes. So what's needed, I think, again, is to work outside of the silo of a single disease area and pull together a range of examples that cover lots of different disease areas to say, these are the examples, this is what we see every day. It's also it's a good time to partner with the industry on things like this, because they also shape that system, that compassionate use system. So where did they, and they have much more expertise than we as patient organizations or advocates have in working through local regulations. I mean, that's part of their job. So it's really understanding where are those opportunities for change and building the case studies and the evidence base that supports that spans multiple disease areas. It's a policy decision at the end of the day, so it goes back to what Nicola was saying, but having those examples that span the population, it's not just me in terms of the indication I care about. The indication I care about is opening that up and saying across the board, this is unfair.
Thank you for that. So another great call to action for the lung cancer patient community. Thank you so much, Neil, for your input. In the last 1 minute, I want to thank not just you, but the other speakers. You've just been fantastic. You've given such a great introduction to these very, very important topics. And I think people will have learned a lot from your input. Thanks to the audience for joining us and for your questions, for your interest. I'm sure this is just the beginning and that there will be more. It's very, very clear there's an interest in learning more about these topics. I think we will certainly be knocking on your doors moving forward. And hopefully, as a result of this small start, the lung cancer patient community in Europe will really, really start to have a much bigger voice in various different decision-making processes. Nothing about us without us. Thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.